Uncertainty, pressure, change. The people who navigate this world tend to have something in common. They've been at the edge and they know what that taught them. I'm Charlie Peschardt and this is the Resilient Edge podcast. My guest today is Mr. Nick Spicer, CEO of Your Eco, solar renewable energy company based out of the UK. The reason why I've got Nick here today really is I find his story absolutely compelling, going from a village down the road from where I grew up to
same nightclubs.
Indeed, same nightclubs, and into the military for a similar period of time, and then out via disaster response and into a world of entrepreneurship and renewable energy. So we're going to talk about that with him today. So Nick, welcome to the Resilient Edge.
Okay, and thank you for having me. And hello all. Sorry you have to put up with me for the next while.
Mate, it's a pleasure. I know that everyone's going to be fascinated to hear your view.
You know, I can play this at some real tangents. So.
Nick, let's kick off. How would you describe our relationship, how we know each other?
Well, we obviously know each other through the world of disaster response, the early days of Team Rubicon and all the fun that was on that initial journey, and us coming out to the BVI after Hurricane Irma in 2017, and the world and the journey that's led both us on, but probably in particular yourself, and how that's entwined with your life along the way today.
Yeah, absolutely. You've spoken there about the Team Rubicon journey, and that was a real time in both of our lives. But the BVI was indeed the thing that changed both of our lives, I guess, or my life and our friendship and relationship, I guess.
Do you remember on and already I'm going off on a tangent, the first evening we met in BVI in Tortola? Well, the first time we were walking into the building where we were staying, we met your now wife, and that evening, do you remember what we did?
I can't remember now.
Sat on the floor drinking old fashions out of plastic shaker I brought.
Oh, classy to the end.
Yeah, exactly. There we go.
Yes, as you say, met the lady who's now my wife. And then you obviously were really kicking forward with your eco at that time and trying to bring renewable energy into the disaster response space. And then here we are now, 10 years after we first met each other, and you're delivering some solar energy projects in the BVI, and it's all been a lot of change. Did you always know what you wanted to do?
Really good question. Hard to unpack. I think purpose probably features quite heavily in that. I knew I wanted to join the military from an early stage. And I think one of the key drivers for me was wanting to make a difference. And I remember watching, I can't remember if it was BBC or what it was. There was a TV series or a film, and it was called Warriors. And it was on the humanitarian work in Bosnia with an armored infantry group. It kind of brought about this thing for me of wanting to, this whole, and my late commanding officer always used to say, Colonel Andy, who unfortunately, rest in peace, passed away. And it was that, if not you, then who? And I think for me, it was always the, wanting to command soldiers and lead soldiers, and that whole, if not you, then who? And understanding that young men and women are moving off serving their country and going into sometimes hostile environments. And actually, I wanted to be able to go really sort of look after them. Some of these soldiers have not come from the easiest backgrounds, and hopefully provide that leadership role and, ultimately care and nurture it, bring soldiers back in. So I think in one vein, that was always a huge takeaway, that I had the privilege of commanding and leading soldiers, but also every soldier, I led on operations came home, which is something I don't take lightly, because was certainly not the same for so many who might not be with us today. And so that's something I was immensely proud of, but wanted to do. And then I think I decided there was a stage where, came back from Baghdad in 2009, where I was commanding the last combat unit out there, and decided that getting shot at for a career was probably not something I wanted to do anymore. When Ella, our eldest daughter, found out she was on her way. But I wanted to carry on doing something purposeful. And I think ultimately that's where renewable energy came in. I studied advanced colouring in at the University of Leeds, so human geography, but with a side of sustainability, and solar had always been something in clean energy that I wanted to get into. But that wasn't without a couple of bodged jobs before, and realising I had a complete lack of commercial awareness and acumen before finding myself in that sphere. But yeah, an interesting transition. But yeah, going back to it, I guess purpose is one of those things. And I've always wanted to try and hope that can leave a positive legacy. And I think going from, war on the front line of something to hopefully fighting the war against climate change on the front line was very much, I guess, the narrative of what I wanted to do.
I think we all recognize that sense of purpose being a core driver in how we have made choices when we were younger, and then potentially bring that into our second lives as well.
Yeah, and even today, Your Eco, we're currently working towards our gold membership of the Armed Forces Covenant, and the majority of our installers and team we employ are now all ex-military, and actually we're almost making a play now that anyone new coming in is from the ex-military environment. And I think we're trying to create a business that delivers purpose, and actually, for me, that purpose is playing our role in the fight against climate change, trying to leave and create a positive legacy for this generation and the next, but also try and create the conditions of a business that's purposeful for others to come in.
And I think in terms of the veterans piece, you're founder of Veterans and Solar as well, is that correct?
Yeah, recently founded a few weeks ago, and I think realising myself and a chap called Tom Hargreaves has set this up, along with Gareth Williams, who is founder of Veterans Can and Job Oppo, and helped bring it together, really. So we're in our infancy, but I think it's trying to help others, provide a bit of a shining light for what we're doing in a position of advocacy, but also hopefully helping others transition into the space and a growing market.
And that transition, changing out of the military into a new world, what would you say changed the most?
I left the military, young army officer, feeling very confident. I've got this, management, leadership, all these great things. And actually, I absolutely tanked on a job I went for. There were about 4 of us that left. I think 3 went to the city and the back door, as often they find themselves when you leave the military. I thought management consultancy sounded like a really good gig. And I went to an interview with a company. They had an office in Wiltshire, just outside Warminster, and one in London. Anyway, I went to the first interview. It was great. I call that the good bloke interview, where they go, oh, yeah, you might be the part and everything else. I then went to meet the partners in London, and the interview lasted less than 5 minutes. And they asked me a mathematical question it was about a printer. They said, oh, we're looking after a print company. They print so many things a day at this much. How much does that equate to? And I asked if I could use my calculator, to which they said, do you not know how to do that? I said, no. And he abruptly said, well, I think we should stop the interview here. And I said, I thought management consulting was like, helping people. And they went, no, there's this financial element that you actually have to look at. And I was like, I have a clue. Like, the end bill I've ever paid is my mess bill, and that's all I've ever known to manage financially. And I think I realized that I had a complete lack of commercial acumen at that stage, which I think is always one of the limitations of the military. And whenever I speak to anyone and give them advice, is trying to talk about commercial acumen. And also trying to make sure your CV reads, especially from an infantry army, is different for you flying helicopters. That's a great skill set. Mine was I can walk a long distance and shoot things, which in some ways is not as transferable. So we talked about the economic side and everything else. And one of the best things I did was I took what I call my commercial apprenticeship. And I realized that I needed to understand business and everything else. And am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
Yeah, you can say what you like, Nick.
But when someone said, oh, you should go speak to this guy called Mike Church, who runs this business called MJ Church. And sort of turned up to Mike's office, who incredible individual, from, bulldozer and dumper truck through to running an incredible civil engineering business. Knocked on his door and said, Mike, I'm Nick. And it was almost like, what do you want, you posh prick? And I was like, shit. I said, I'd like a job. Someone said you were looking for this. He said, well, what are you going to do? And anyway, I ended up taking a job with Mike, looking after selling recycled stone and all these things. It was the most incredible year where I learned business from a true entrepreneur. Everything from 6 o'clock in the morning getting shouted at as to why his fucking trucks weren't on the road and they cost him this much money, and how much fuel do you think these cost to run if they're not running through to this person hasn't paid, they need to go get their money because of cash flow and everything else. And it was the most wonderful commercial experience, a commercial apprenticeship for a year that really, I would say, changed my life in some ways, but also was the foundations, I think, for now. And I still look back to all those lessons. And I try and implore anyone else to do it. And so to Mike Church, who I know you will not be listening to this, but thank you for helping shape it in many ways, because it was great. And then that was really when, wanted to go into renewables and found the opportunity to jump across.
But in terms of that uncertainty of leaving, talking about the confidence of the young officer having done a load of pretty gnarly stuff normally, and successfully, you see that gap, or reality starts hitting, you start realizing how much you don't know. What was your approach to filling that gap? How deliberate was
I
that?
think you have to be, who is it? Brené Brown talks about it. And I will give you credit for this one, Amanda, my wife, who talks about her books and stuff. And I've started reading a lot of them. And you're talking about vulnerability as a superpower. And it really resonates. And I think to be vulnerable is a massive strength. And I think there's an acknowledgement of, and I talk about it now with the team, and we say as a business, you don't know what you don't know, right? But when you do know, then you can do something about it. And I think, that also links, I guess, to the competency cycle, whether you're unconsciously competent and how that goes down and everything else. But I think you've got to understand that you're consciously incompetent. And actually, that's not a bad thing because you're consciously aware of it. It's worse when you're unconsciously incompetent. And so actually to go, hold on, I don't know this. I now need to become consciously competent to move around the cycle. And I think that for me is that the vulnerability piece plus an eagerness to understand where you are. And I think it's like anything, it's probably taking stock of your position and understanding what you need to do to get to somewhere. And I suppose it's about action, isn't it? Whatever that phrase is, inactivity or not delivering action is the worst, means actually you want to do something. Might not necessarily be the right approach, and you might find some hurdles in the way, but actually there's something about action that's positive. Yeah. Anxiety doesn't like action.
Yeah, I remember this from Dartmouth. I joined the Navy. Best thing you can do is make the right decision. The next best thing you can do is make the wrong decision, but make a decision, get going, and you can test and adjust as you go. So in terms of that, I want to just stay on this transition just for one more moment. And in terms of like what you had to leave behind in the military, I think the vulnerability piece is quite an interesting one because I didn't feel the military is brilliant at encouraging vulnerability. I would say, you want to try to be confident and push through. But what did you feel you had to leave behind? And then what did you find yourself carrying forward that you didn't necessarily expect to need?
I think you're right. First of all, I don't think the military's great at promoting vulnerability, and I think it misses an opportunity. And I think vulnerability is probably seen as a weakness within the military. And I think in some ways, one of the reasons I left the military is, being honest, I struggled with the leadership in the military and the culture at the time of where I was. I don't think it was a healthy culture. And I think there was some elements of poor, verging on toxic leadership. And I think that, certainly no vulnerability. It was absolutely the opposite. It was a machoism approach. And I think, dare I say, almost can verge on bullying in those environments, if people want to call it that. I think what you do lose when you leave the military is a bit of sense of purpose. We know what that gives you. You probably lose a bit of a sense of camaraderie, which I think we can relate to. And I also think you do inevitably lose a sense of status. You go from one day being called sir and saluted to the next day, oi mate, wherever you are. And whatever anyone says, that's a bit of getting used to. And there's no, you leave the military, you pack up your kit, you hand it in and you walk out the door and everyone goes, thanks very much, bye. And you're done. And you're like, well, hold on a minute. Like you kind of lose a bit of identity. Every day you wake up in green, you've got your uniform, you look smart, you put your headdress on, you're burying, you walk around and, there's all that. And then the next day it's like, yeah, over to you. So I think so many things to take from it. But I think, and we hire quite a few people straight from the military. And actually one of, Matt Peschardt, who used to be our company signaller, went on to have a great career and, from having to deal with us as young officers, as our company signallers, being frantically called over to fix the radios in my Warrior through to being an LE major and flying in his career. And Matt's recently come on to join us, which has been a real positive and highlight for me. But actually, it's interesting, his journey, because he's straight out of the military and what that looks like to him and how it's gone. And equally, with our ops manager, a guy called Richie Sixsmith, who hired recently, was my colour sergeant at Sandhurst. Who'd been on to another role before, since he's left the military, and actually realised it wasn't where he wanted to be, and actually, hopefully, we're offering and providing an environment that's more, suitable and provides that purpose. But it's hard. I think so many people leaving. There's different things. What do people want? And I don't think, people just don't always know. So that's I've gone completely off tangent, and I'll leave it there.
No, that's good. And I think it always brings me back to the Team Rubicon days where you and I, but also, the rest of the sort of leadership team, I would say, so the senior volunteers and the paid staff, obviously worked with a lot of people. That organisation grew massively. I think the day that I joined, there was something like 100 people had come through some level of induction or deployment. And a year later, it was near 1,000. And so many of those people were veterans. And one of the big conversations that kept coming up were the challenges over transition, how people didn't necessarily know where they wanted to go, maybe some questions over the quality of support that was available during that transition. There was a statistic kicking around at the time that, and don't quote me specifically, but the gist was most people that come out and take a job leave that job within a year because they've completely miscalibrated what they thought they needed when they left. And it's very interesting to see how people do go about managing that.
I think that statistic, I'd be one of them. Richie would be one of them, who I mentioned, and I think that is, very much the case.
So let's talk maybe more generally about the approaches to life of going through change. We've talked about careers, but fundamentally, everyone has stuff in their life that's easier and harder. And so what would you say might be the hardest thing that you think you've gone through, either personally or professionally? And probably if not more importantly, what was it that you found helped getting through?
I think for me, one of the hardest things was when started your eco, with young children. The two girls, Ella and Neela, were under 5. And actually, it was a bit of setting up a business and rolling it on black, borrowing money, off we go. How are we going to pay the bills? And Amanda was working in the corporate world in biotech at the stage. And it was actually, hold on a minute, is this going to work? Isn't going to work? And it was like, I really think I can make a business out of this with a go on my own. But the guilt of not being around kids at that age where that there's so much connection you can have with them, but what does that look like? And I think, trying to set up a business with young children in challenging economic conditions was just much harder than I thought it was going to be. And the grind, and then you have things like cash flow in and all of those things that people talk about and warn you about, but until you do it, you don't really understand it. And the elation of going to, the slog of going to village hall and flogging solar panels, call it, right, through to getting your next biggest project, which was, I don't know, 16, 20 panels on someone's house. Then it's doing a small commercial project. And you look what we're doing today and you just think, oh, wow, like where have we come from? But you'd get a project, you'd go, I'm all good. And then you'd realize that actually you needed to keep feeding it. And I think just that, the commercial reality of running a business compounded by family life and children and everything else was, tough. But I think in terms of getting through it, I think there's what's the right word? A sort of sheer doggedness of determination that's just like, I'm going to do this however it needs to be done, just drag myself through it. And that's the way. And I suppose I've often approached things with that approach of single-mindedness. And I think sometimes you can almost call it single-mindedness. You can call it laser-focused. You can also call it selfishness. There is just a part of you that's just like, that's what I'm doing and nothing's stopping me or getting in the way. And I think that's how I got out of it. And one of the things we talk about now, and actually we talk about Be More Buffalo as one of our values of our business.
Yeah.
The story goes, hate North America, although my good friend Anthony Ross, who we call Bison, will dispute this, but we're not going to call it Be More Bison. We are going to stick with Be More Buffalo. Is it's in effect talking about, buffalo when there's a storm on the prairies, the storm rolls in, the buffalo sticks its head down and runs through the storm and gets to the other side quicker. Whereas let's call it the cow or the cattle, they sit around, they run around, and they stay in the suck for longer. And I think there's something in that for us, of one of our values of Be More Buffalo, that sometimes you just got to put your head down and punch through the storm, because actually it's brighter on the other side.
So I do love that Be More Buffalo. So I'm now going to ask you a question, which you might well answer with Be More Buffalo, but obviously this podcast is the Resilient Edge. My post-military world is in the nature of resilience.
Yeah.
But resilience means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So I'm going to ask you for your definition of resilience, and whether it's something that people are more predisposed to, or whether it's something that you can build.
I think Be More Buffalo is a way of dealing with things in a resilient way, but I wouldn't say it defines resilience. I think resilience to me is defined as, what is resilience? It's able to weather the storm. So being more buffalo is getting through the storm, but to be resilient is to be able to weather the storm and come out in good order on the other side. Maybe that's one way of looking at it, whatever that storm is, metaphorically or otherwise. I think resilience is the ability to cope with things, and how you cope. Some of us don't cope well, but you can still be resilient. How you're resilient is probably a different question. I think resilience to me means the ability to deal with, uncomfortable situations, deal with whatever's thrown at you, whatever that may be. So it's not really a definition. I guess resilience is just knowing that you're able to get through situations. And that might be from a mental, a physical, personal, commercial, whatever it is. It's just knowing that you're going to find a way through. And maybe there's an element of belief in resilience as well. That you probably have to have belief of one form or another to be resilient in order to see yourself through a situation.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And it's one of those hopes, not a strategy, right? You've got to have the faith but the knowledge, you can trust the capability to get through.
Yeah. If you look at resilience, I guess, you touched upon faith. And for those people who are very religious, they will maybe see faith as a way to help them through hard times, challenging times. Other people have their own belief or confidence or whatever that might be. And I think there's so many things, as you say, so many layers to unpick of what that means to people, and how also you're resilient, but how you deal with situations that requires you to be resilient.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're seeing that more and more nowadays with both, the growth of social media and the influence that has on people, in terms of, how do I compare to people that I wouldn't even known existed 10 years ago, to obviously the polycrisis world that we're in, geopolitical issue after geopolitical issue. And that's been going on arguably for the best part of 20 years now. So it is challenging. And whether it's you as an individual or you as a business, there needs to be those mechanisms to survive and move through. So for you, I think when I first met you, you just done the Marathon des Sables. Yeah. And I think the first time I actually came across you, I was looking at a Garmin GPS and saw some random updates all across the Sahara Desert. I was like, what is this? But that's this guy Nick's been out testing in the kit. So you've done a lot of endurance events, obviously military, starting your own business, a lot of conflicting priorities.
Yeah.
Tell me, like, when things are tough, what is it that tends to keep you going?
I hate losing. But it's not losing. I just don't like to not complete what I started. I have this, that part of you that says, I'm going to quit this or I don't want to do it. You might say it, but I know you're not going to do it, because I'd never look at myself again if I didn't finish something. And I think there's also something, whether it's proving to myself, whether it's wanting to try and, maybe still prove to the kids or inspire the kids a bit, that adventure and all these great things. But I also love what the body's capable of. And I think that the human body is driven by a mental resilience And I think it can do so much more physically than the mind thinks it can. And I'm not a fast runner, but I'm a plodder. And I was talking to someone about this the other day. I could happily go out now and run a marathon. It wouldn't be pretty, but I know I could do it because I know I wouldn't give up. And if someone said, go do 26 miles now, I am not going to set a fast time, but it'd get done. And I think I enjoy pushing myself to make sure that I think you get comfortable if you don't push yourself outside of your limits. And so I think sometimes endurance events for me are an ability to put myself in an extreme circumstance or situation that I don't know if I could do it. And a friend of mine used to call me an idiot in sport, which was based on the whole idiot abroad thing. He was a comedian, a guy called Jared Christmas, and we were laughing about it. And Jared was like, I'm going to call you the idiot in sport because everything I'd done was a first. And my whole thing I was trying to do was go, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to go do the hard bit first. So Marathon des Sables was my first ever marathon. I do something called Brutal Ironman, which was an Ironman around Snowdonia, and the marathon was up and down Snowdon. And that was my first triathlon. I'd never swum open water, and I swam from Europe to Asia across the Bosphorus. And I almost got stopped because I asked if I could do breaststroke, and they went no. And then the first paddle I ever did, which was the worst thing I've ever done, was the Yukon race. The other year, best mate of mine, Dan Holloway, and it was something that really took resilience and probably was the closest I ever came to wanting to quit. Less Dan begging me not to, but I wasn't going to give up.
You set a record in that, did you?
Yeah, we did. Yeah, I think we were the first or quickest British canoe team to have done this race. And as they say, more people have climbed Everest than been past Dawson, this city. And it's a 1,000-mile unsupported race. And you've got 10 days to paddle up the Yukon, basically up to the Arctic Circle in Alaska. And it is the most wonderfully boring, monotonous, ridiculous thing I've ever done. And I thought it was canoeing. Like, you know, when you're on the River Wye and you like paddle and you like admiring the scenery. And I got there, and the first night we clearly went out, Dan and I, and, daylight came and we were still out having a great riotous time. And the next morning, feeling slightly worse for wear, it's one of the locals who was sort of mentoring and talked about it. And I said to him, I said, like, how much do you actually have to paddle? And I just thought the current was going to take you. He said, oh, no, you have to paddle like 1 stroke a second. And I was like, huh? And Dan and I had been on the river once in our canoe, and it was an absolute spectacular failure of us trying to rewrite a canoe. Anyway, it was 1 stroke a second for 18 hours a day. And it took us just over 6 days, and it was thoroughly miserable. And actually the river had some current to it, but it's also like a freaking mile wide, the Yukon River, with nothing to see. So there was a lot of nothingness. But yeah, and that was something really brought about resilience. Actually, the hardest thing for me was not having contact with the outside world. And in this day and age where these things, and I'm like a teenager, I'm hooked to it from a perspective of business, but also family and, not being able to know real time. I suppose my greatest fear is always something happening to the children and the girls and the family. And so not being able to know really sparked my anxiety, which is something I probably admit I struggle with, that anxious mind. And actually, I think anxiety probably drives me in a way to be productive. Because as I said, I think anxiety doesn't like action. But yeah, it really tested on the resilience side, mentally, but physically.
Yeah, that's. I remember seeing the photos of you and Dan training.
Yeah,
training, and then then the photos of when you were done.
It was the worst thing I've ever done, and it wasn't even type 2 fun. It was just, I have never cried so much, I think, as when I saw the bridge at the end. But it's something I've just about forgiven Dan for. But it was incredible. And actually to have shared that as well with such a good friend, a close friend, was, you can't put it into context, but it was, I'm not doing it again.
Fair enough. I think that the shared hardship piece comes back to the military a lot as well, doesn't it? In terms of that camaraderie and there's not many shared hardships. There are some, but not many that are equivalent to the challenges of going on deployment or even going through training, to be honest. When you're coming in from a completely different world, being shaped in a different direction to what you thought was possible, and then
It's amazing. And it is quite funny because, obviously my colour sergeant sixsmith at the time, now Richie, ops manager, I was talking to him about it, just saying how I had the most incredible time at Sandhurst on reflection. And there were moments that were absolute hell and grueling. And, why are you throwing my clothes, colour sergeant, out the window because they're not perfectly ironed? Or why are you ripping my bed up because it's not properly made? And why am I pouring an empty water bottle over my head at 5 a.m, having listened to the shipping forecast and Royal Britannia? But, there's standards that stand you in good stead for life, and they're amazing. And I do think I think Sandhurst is incredible, and that's a whole other topic. But those shared hardships you go through with people, and I think you're right that, and it's interesting, they oscillate because you're up, someone else is down, and it's the ability to support each other through the good and the bad. And I think it's very rare in life and in friendships that, how often do we talk or whomever and go, how's things going? That's brilliant. There's never that moment where everyone goes, that's great. And everyone goes, oh, cool. There's always a, or someone's going, yeah, it's a great day. And so, I've got back to work or something and this has happened. The oscillation's real and the shared hardship. And I think that's everything in life, isn't it? And so resilience, I suppose it links back to an organization. To be a resilient organization, you've got to make sure there's some form of redundancy, because not everyone is high performing all the time. And if you were, you wouldn't be talking about words like resilient, because everyone would be crushing life and the world in which we live it. But that's not the reality.
Yeah, definitely. So let me ask you specifically then, what do you think good resilience looks like in an organization? And or where do you think people go wrong in this space?
I think it's trust and a strong culture. I think it's making sure that, it's a safe environment, culturally safe, that people feel supported and nurtured, and what that looks like. We talk about the mission command process a lot, and we talk about, our military approach to doing things. And I think that's establishing a strong vision of what you want to achieve, left and right of art, don't do this. This is your constraints on time or budget, whatever it might be. The military would say, don't shoot that way, don't shoot this way. And what you want people to achieve, but not telling them how to do it in a prescriptive way, but what you want to achieve as an outcome and the parameters in which to achieve it, and then empowering them. But I think also making sure that it's a culture where it's safe to fail. And I think there's an importance of fail fast and actually making it safe for people to do so, but understanding that also, I suppose, in particular, in a small growing entrepreneurial startup, don't make the same mistake twice. So there's a difference between, we made a mistake, great, versus once you do it, you learn from it. And so I think resilience has to be fostering an environment that's cohesive and supportive, but also where people are trusting of each other and I suppose have each other's backs. And you don't want it like, dare I say, some corporate cultures, which is, driven by individual pursuits rather than the commonality of the greater good. And I suppose that's in a military perspective, you have such a cohesive team because you're all focused on one output and looking after each other, esprit de corps, band of brothers. How do you create that in the commercial world and in the business context? That's much harder to do. But I think it goes back to things like what we hope to do is create purpose, but hope, and then the conditions where culturally people want to be a part of it. And as a result, if you have a clear alignment of what you're seeking to achieve and people buy into that vision and what that looks like and what it's trying to achieve, people understand, how that's created. And I think when you talk about resilience and how do you create it, I, again, hark back to those military things and Sandhurst teachings. I still talk about the Sandhurst motto of serve to lead, which you flick on its head as lead to serve. And I think there's an importance that sometimes you have to serve people to be able to lead them. I suppose it borders into leadership, and sometimes you have to lead people to serve people. But equally, you need to know what everyone's doing. And I think one of the key things is understanding everyone's role within the plan, but also what people do, and understanding that sometimes, as we'll talk about, you're not always on the log. You remember the log run when someone's on the log and someone's not. But don't be Jack, because when you need to get back on the log, don't leave someone on there for too long. And I think you need to understand that to be a resilient business, sometimes you're not. And we talk about the main effort each week. This is our main effort of what we want to achieve, and you're on it, you're not. Sometimes you're on the main effort, and sometimes you're paying a support role to that. But sometimes you're on it, or whatever that might look like. And I think you need to have a degree of redundancy to be resilient, but have trust and that alignment that makes people want to step into a gap if they see it. And I think it's the confidence, therefore, for people to fill that gap, knowing that they're empowered to do so if it presents itself. And I suppose that's what I hope makes us a resilient organization, that I know if someone's not in or something's not happened, someone will step into that position and jump on the log, and you won't have to ask them, they'll do it.
That definition of resilience, or that description of resilience, I think ties very closely to leadership cultures and leadership behaviors.
Yeah.
And so can I ask how you would go about defining leadership and whether that's changed over the course of your career?
Yeah. And I suppose two things jump up to me: the leadership curve, which I'll come back to. You'll have to remind me if not. And also what leadership looks like. And I think leadership and management for me are very different. And I think I say this categorically, and I do say it tongue in cheek, but I also think it's probably kind of true. I don't think I'm a great manager, and I don't think I particularly like management, but I like leadership, and hope that from a leadership perspective, I do okay at it. I think what is leadership? I think leadership is providing so many things to so many people. But for me, I suppose leadership is providing a vision, a beacon. There's the classic tally ho over the top and follow me. And I think in the early days of your EK, it was very much, this is what we're doing, follow me, off we go. I think leadership now is having to understand what that vision looked like, what's best for the organization and what's right for the business. And I think understanding goes back to vulnerability as well. And I think I was talking to a friend, he's a professor at the University of Bath, who I coach football with, a chap called Jens Nordfeldt. And we were talking about the leadership curve, and I was talking about, business and everything else like we do at football training, and coach the Bath City girls' football teams. And there was a realization that I probably wasn't right to lead the organization in its current form. And I would say as a result that leadership has somewhat transferred. And I suppose I take more of a, what's the right word, brand representation, face of the business, probably a leadership figure, but actually core leadership probably, and I would say is Amanda running the business. And she brings with her different skill sets and qualities to me. And I think that's why different leaders sometimes are needed in different situations. And I think if I look at an entrepreneurial journey of a startup, sometimes you need to be a little bit resilient at the beginning, a little bit bold, a little bit, as you'll know with me, happy taking risks, happy working in the gray area and, going, actually, this is my plan and this is what I'm doing. And, as he said, taking decisive action. And then I think sometimes there's also a need to understand when those approaches aren't quite what an organization needs, and it needs a wider leadership perspective. And so maybe that's hopefully what good leadership is, understanding when's the right time for what type of leadership, and when also maybe at times your leadership style is not effective.
That's a very fair point. And I think any of us that have had some level of responsibility for getting something done has lived some element of leadership. And there's definitely times where some approaches are more appropriate and successful than others. So if you look back at your biggest challenges as a leader, is there anything you would say you wish you knew then that now you feel like that's what I need to do?
There's so many, and hindsight's a wonderful thing. But if you apply hindsight, I think you would you would change so many things in your life and things that you've got wrong or decisions and all those things that have ramifications. And I don't think so, because I think if I said there's something I'd do different, I don't think I'd be here today.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something about just accepting the reality of what it is that's brought everyone here today. Now, would I be saying that if my decisions had not gotten me here today? Maybe, but I think I've done the best. My dad always used to say to me, he used to say, Nick, if you're going to be, he said, I don't care what you are in life, but be the best version of it. He said, if you're going to be a milk float, be the Ferrari of the milk float world. And I never wanted to be one of those dads that said the same thing to my kids, but of course I do. And it's always resonated with my dad. And so, I wanted to be the Ferrari of the milk float world, and I wanted to be the best of what I could be in my sector and try and get there. And I think you can only do the best of your ability. Some people are better at things than others. I could not do for a moment what any of our team do with the ability they have to create their work on the electrical side and mechanical side and what they can deliver. I couldn't fly a helicopter. But doing what I do, I hope I've done okay, but it's probably the best of my ability to get here. Do I have anything I'd like to change? Yes, lots of things, but that's hindsight. But I am who I am, so I don't think I could change it. And I think I go back to it by probably saying I'm relatively stubborn, and I don't like to lose, don't like to quit or not succeed. I think lose can sound like a sore loser, which hopefully I'm not. But I think there's just that ability, that drive and that purpose and passion that says that's what I'm going to do.
Okay, so in terms of skills or character traits, with the situation the world is in, I'm not going to say the state because that suggests it's only negative, and I think it's not only negative at all. But the situation the world's in at the moment, what skills or character traits do you think people would be most well served by developing in order to be able to navigate where we're at and what the world's going to look like over the next 15, 50 years?
I'm going to go back to my word of the day. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Brene Brown, of vulnerability.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be really insightful / wonderful if some of our global leaders had a bit of vulnerability right now and maybe admitted that some things might not have been as intended, or actually this might be the time to accept that this wasn't what we hoped it would be, and maybe there's a different way. And maybe it goes back to stubbornness playing its part. So I think vulnerability is key. And I suppose emotional intelligence to understanding where people are. If you applied vulnerability and emotional intelligence to some of the world in which we live in today, I think, would people look at stuff differently? You hope so. Again, that probably implies things are bad. And there's so many incredible things happening, but I also think there's perspective and seeing things through different people's lenses.
But vulnerability, emotional intelligence, and perspective. Yeah. Humility.
Yes, good word.
So, final question. You obviously mentioned how when you and Amanda were expecting Ella, that started shifting your perspective on your career and deciding to leave the army. Obviously, I'm a relatively new parent compared to your time frame, so that is the motivation for this. But what advice would you give a 2-year-old girl now growing up in the world that we're currently building?
What would I tell a 2-year-old today? Have an open mind. Seize the opportunity. Take the road less traveled. And enjoy life as an adventure.
That's beautiful, Nick. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate your insights and sharing your experiences. So if people want to connect with you, Nick, where do they find you? On LinkedIn? Nick Spicer.
Yeah. Nick Spicer on LinkedIn. At your eco, you should also have a look at what we're doing with the reduce our carbon and some of the great stuff we're doing.
I'm absolutely horrified that we haven't even spoken about reduce our carbon. So I will have to get you back again and we'll talk about that because did my master's thesis on it. Good stuff, Nick. Appreciate your time. It's been a pleasure.
If this conversation has given you something to think about, about leading through pressure, navigating change, or building the kind of clarity that holds even when things get tough, that is exactly what I work on at The Resilience Edge. You can find me, Charlie Peschardt, on LinkedIn, on Instagram at The Resilience Edge Coaching, or via my website, theresilienceedge.com. Whether you're looking to think more clearly under pressure in your personal or professional life, or leading an organisation building the resilience to survive and thrive through uncertainty and change, come find me and sharpen your resilience edge.